What is up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to FudgeMuppet. This is the Elder Scrolls podcast. I'm Scott, here with Michael and Drew, as always, and today we are talking all about Jyggalag, technically the only Daedric Prince that we haven't talked about so far on the podcast.
Save the best for last. You know how it goes.
And perfect timing with the anniversary of Skyrim. It's been 10 years and we're here to talk about a Daedric Prince that didn't feature in Skyrim at all.
I feel like Jyggalag, though, would be very...
Except in Creation Club.
Yeah, well, I feel like Jyggalag's very, into the whole idea of re-releasing the same thing over and over and over, perfect order. Skyrim's perfect, let's just re-release it.
Skyrim's re-releases is our Grey March.
Yeah, exactly.
We just have to do it constantly. Only for another 5 or 6 years, don't worry. And then Jyggalag will be free, and so will we all. But yeah, I feel like a lot of people aren't really big fans of Jyggalag, and there's kind of a good reason for it. He is unique in that, I mean, to get right into it off the bat, he's kind of the only Anuic Daedric Prince. He's initially, we've been through the creation story a million times, but you've got the forces of order and change, chaos, stasis, and you normally associate the Daedra, the ancestors to Mundus, to be the kind of to be the Anuic entities. And they're more orderly. They, provide the structure. Whereas the Daedra weren't keen on that, and they're much more chaotic in their influence. And Jyggalag seems to be very obviously orderly, Anuic, but he's a Daedric Prince.
Do you think maybe you could get more insight if you thought, maybe thinking about it in terms of rather than just the chaos versus order, but rather the everlasting versus limitation kind of thing, and maybe it makes a little more sense. Maybe his version of order is a little less like sort of infinite light, but a little bit more like a limited form of this is what order is. It's maybe perhaps like crystalline, and it's like this specific do you know what I mean, kind of? Like maybe that helps a little bit, gives a little bit more clarity of how you could have like a different, because generally like limitations is sort of a more
it could be in design. I guess it's interesting to note that when he was the word Jyggalag was made, he didn't really have a concept yet. I think there's a Ted Peterson quote from 2001, and it says that he was just added into the On Oblivion book. So they had an extra Daedric Prince in case they needed one later down the road. I think he said, so it could be, the Daedra of poisons or unattractive hairdos. Cringe, but you could see how he's not as fleshed out as the other Daedric princes, even though I would say as just a word in On Oblivion, they did a pretty cool job with him as, coming back in the Shivering Isles DLC, and everything to do with incorporating him into Sheogorath.
Yeah.
And all of the duality there, which is obviously what makes him the most interesting, I think, to people. If Jyggalag just existed as Jyggalag, it wouldn't be nearly as cool as if he was this Daedric Prince that ended up being cursed by the other Daedra because, his order was so powerful that he was made to be the complete opposite of order, a madman and chaotic, and be Sheogorath. But then, as we know, the curse is that at the end of every era, which isn't specified. It's not like the eras that we know necessarily, like the Dawn era, First era, Second, and so on. It's just whatever the Daedra define as an era. It's arbitrary, but he comes back once every cycle and basically wipes out everything Sheogorath has done, and he comes back kind of as Sheogorath. So Sheogorath himself is not present in the throne room because he kind of has to go and be Jyggalag and attack his own realm. And that's why he's not there at the end. But as you know, if you've played the Shivering Isles DLC, you put a stop to Jyggalag by kind of mantling Sheogorath, or beginning to, and then it's kind of implied later that the champion did mantle and become Sheogorath.
His whole premise is kind of like that cliche that, when they say that madness is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. And that's his entire identity after Sheogorath was created, because he goes on this grey march, destroys the entire realm, always seems to fail in the process, and then everything gets reset, and then he has to do it again and again and again, and it never comes to fruition. So it's kind of like, in a sense, despite being associated with determinism and order, he is equally the Daedric Prince of Madness, just like Sheogorath is, if that makes sense. Because, what he's doing, his obsession with orderliness in a place, in Oblivion, where order is never going to be possible, he's constantly trying to impose it where it will never fit.
One of Sothasil's apostles says this in one of the books, The Truth in Secrets, Volume 3, says, "Of the Daedra, only the Grey Prince of Order knew his nature, and he went mad in the knowing," which is also connecting that he's already mad before even you get the colourful sort of Sheogorath stuff. And interestingly I like how that kind of implies a little bit more like it was just he went mad knowing his true nature rather than the other Daedric princes doing it to him. But also, just you were talking about how Errors and the Grey March and stuff don't necessarily align with ours, with Mundus's current time. Also consider that we don't know when Jyggalag became sort of when Sheogorath as an entity became a thing and the Grey March sort of cycle started happening. It could have even been previous Kalpas or something like that. We don't, because technically a lot of Oblivion and Aetherius and stuff exist outside of the sort of bind of Mundus. So
it makes you wonder if Jyggalag existed when Mundus was theorized by Lorcan, because I was struggling to imagine how he would engage with that possibility. I mean, Scott, you mentioned before that it's kind of like perhaps he'd like the idea of Mundus because it is this small limitation that can be quite easily controlled by a god. You've got all of these rules set in place by the Earthbones and whatnot. The laws of nature, physics, time is all applied to Mundus. But at the same time, perhaps being the Prince of Determinism, maybe he was able to foresee the fact that were he involved in the process of creating Mundus, his power would be trapped in it. So perhaps that's why he decided to take a step back if he happened to exist at that time, if this was pre-Sheogorath. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I get what you mean. Because he's the only thing I guess which we don't know. They say so he has this great library which contains all logical prediction of every detail of the world and every action that would ever take place on Mundus or Oblivion, long before they actually happened. But I think there is a quote somewhere else about it not being able to read the Elder Scrolls, though. That wasn't part of the included, or the prophecies of the Elder Scrolls.
Right.
So I wonder if that's just just that one sort of blind spot or something that sort of technically exists out. My theory, I guess, with a lot of in relation to the Elder Scrolls is it's kind of like the embodiment of mythical sort of storytelling and a mythopoeia where myth makes reality, but determinism it can sort of structure what is everything his great library can see and so on. But the Elder Scrolls prophecies can kind of be written and changed, and it's the myth or it's the big lie, like Lorcan's great lie or his fabrications of the different stories can all create this different kind of tangible outcome.
It creates such an awkward thing because if he knows everything that has and will happen, even in Oblivion, then it doesn't really compute that he would continuously fail in his task of unmaking the Shivering Isles. Because, Sheogorath says that his hatred for this land, for what it represents, is unimaginable, which makes sense with, this being a realm of madness, but him being a god of chaos. Of order.
What if his whole idea, though, is that because he's so obsessed with, the logical order of events and how things should be, that even if he knows that he has to do this and fail, he's so committed because he's insane to this idea of order that he kind of follows it anyway because it is it is as the deduction says it.
He's subject to the principles of determinism that he dutifully follows, so he kind of has to keep doing it even if he's aware of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because to break it would be to break himself.
So somebody else has to break it.
Would be... Well, to break it would be to accept free will, which goes against what he stands for, right? So for him to go against the grain of what his logical deduction says all events should be, would be for him to have to say, I deny myself, because he's kind of like a representation of order, cause and effect, and determinism.
Okay, well, this is where things are going to get weird, I guess. Because does this mean he would also be fully aware that he's about to be set free by the champion of Cyrodiil?
Look.
And then should he
well, hold on.
Also,
let's reference when Sheogorath first came about, the Great Library was destroyed, and only Daius, his chamberlain, Jyggalag's chamberlain, was left alive and contained the knowledge and cursed to live forever. but the Great Library is gone. So
So
gone.
does that mean his knowledge is also gone?
Well,
Potentially, because then why hold a library?
Because Daius is the only one that had the knowledge of the Great Library, and they managed it and so on, for Jyggalag. And he's been disconnected from his lord Jyggalag. And I guess Jyggalag comes back, though, every now and again.
So what's Jyggalag without Daius?
Yeah.
A stickler for the rules, bro. Just a real, just a boring...
Yeah, Daius is an interesting character, but because he's been made immortal, right? But... you don't really know what he knows, right? I mean, it's funny you talk about how you're talking about how myth makes reality and the idea of myth and things. He's literally called Daius of Mytheria, which is this place that we don't know anything about, but just interesting tie in there. But anyway, we don't know that Daius has some, crazy memory capacity, and he remembers the contents of every book that like every fact written down that could ever be or will be or has happened and will happen. We just don't know that. When you meet him, he acts like he has some kind of like omniscient knowledge, and he says like, oh, I know that you will try, but you will fail. And he kind of speaks as if like, he knows what's going to happen because it's all determined to happen, and that, fate is essentially real. But then he's wrong. You prove him wrong. But is that because there's this gap because you're talking about Elder Scrolls, or is it just because Daius, who is essentially, I don't want to say he's immortal, but he's a person who was then made to live forever, basically, to be this librarian and whatnot and a chamberlain. He doesn't have unlimited memory capacity. There's no way he could possibly keep track of all these things without some kind of crazy divine power.
But that could be maybe imbued by Jyggalag or whatever or something.
But then why have the library? If he could put all the knowledge inside of Daius, why have the library itself?
Yeah, I guess so.
I don't know.
I mean, it's a very similar dynamic to Haskell's relationship with Sheogorath. Because you get glimpses of what Haskell was before, and it's almost... I need to find the quote so I don't get this wrong because it's important, but it's almost implied that Haskell kind of somewhat mantled and became a part of Sheogorath.
Yeah.
To the point where maybe Daius is the same towards Jyggalag, or is a parallel of him.
So it was in one of those lore, ESO Chamberlain Haskell answers questions and so on. And someone was sort of asking about a bit of his nature, but he sort of says, I am a vestige, all that remains of a mortal from your world who mantled Sheogorath during an event in a previous time. As a fragment, my memory of the event is fragmentary. I'm hazy on the entire concept of mantling, but it had something to do with Lord Sheogorath, myself, and this Jyggalag of whom you speak. I have asked the Mad God to explain it to me, but he just laughs and says maybe he'll tell me about it next year, whatever that means. So interestingly, I would find it... the way I've kind of interpreted it, like Haskell, and the same kind of proposition about, how the Zealots and Heretics believe in Arden Sul being like the true Sheogorath or something. But basically in previous Grey Marches or so on, that these characters or these people like Haskell, Arden Sul are mortal champions that have mantled Sheogorath in the moment, but still not actually defeated the Grey March and Jyggalag like you do in that final battle. So they're basically failed mantlings. Another comparison could be, do you know how there's all those failed Nerevarines for the Nerevarine prophecy, and it's the prophecy is just bull because everyone's done it over and over again. Until of course it's not, and then it's successful. So a similar kind of thing could have happened here, and then with the Hero of Kvatra, Champion of Cyrodiil, whatever name you want to call him, mantling Sheogorath, fights Jyggalag, but actually wins this time, which I guess would defy the sort of...
So do you think then, if the champion lost, you would become some sort of Haskell character or some other character in the Shivering Isles to live on through the next cycle?
Perhaps, yeah. Because then maybe it's the idea is that there is that maybe Haskell himself even tried to mantle it. This is a champion, failed in fighting Jyggalag. Jyggalag comes back and destroys everything, but then Sheogorath sort of comes back, but maybe there's a fragment of that came back as Haskell, of whom Sheogorath, who was technically still Jyggalag at the time,
and I mean,
decided to have a
just on mantling, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like there is a little bit of a misconception that mantling a god is more of a good thing for the person mantling, but I feel like that's you sacrificing your identity to become like literally, you just become a shroud over this.
Yeah,
over this god,
it's
and
like-
you kind of lose yourself.
Where's
into
the quote
god.
somewhere? It's like walk like them until you become them. But you're becoming them. It's
Yeah,
almost like
they're
the
not
reverse. Like
becoming you.
whereas the idea of Kim would be asserting yourself, your own ego, to the state of a god. Whereas mantling would more so be you're fitting in with another pre-existing myth or god or whatever.
Yeah, you
You're
essentially
becoming
become
that.
a piece of clothing for this god. You know, it's like
Yeah.
it's not necessarily a good thing.
Well, you can kind of see that, I guess, even when you see Sheogorath in the Fourth Era in Skyrim and you talk to him and he references about like some Cyrodiil things that happened during the events of Oblivion, but like he very much resembles the Sheogorath of the Shivering Isles DLC. It's like the same kind of, Scottish accent, whimsical kind of character. Like regardless, and theoretically, like even if an Argonian theoretically like mantled Sheogorath, then they became like Sheogorath and turned into Sheogorath more than Sheogorath turned into them. Would be the idea, but I that's how I would understand mantling, and so yeah.
Well, I mean, to tie it back to Jyggalag, then you could maybe make the argument that Daius isn't particularly powerful, but perhaps mantled Jyggalag in the same sense that Haskell mantled Sheogorath, and it's kind of just like has become his servant as opposed to really offering that a great deal to the prince. I feel like I would give the power more to the prince than the person who's looking after his knowledge.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Another thing to consider too is like the whole conditions around mantling are very vague in the Elder Scrolls lore. Like this is a lot of like conjecture. We're talking about it, but it's just like the at least the idea I sort of see is with Sheogorath, there is like an opening to mantle him when he has to disappear and become Jyggalag. So there's this concept of Sheogorath that was a god moments ago before he turned back into Jyggalag, where you sort of can mantling. It's like there is an opening. There has to be some kind of opening in
it's
the
a
myth.
bit of a power vacuum because that the old Sheogorath is now returning to who he was, which was the Jyggalag. Yeah, that makes sense actually.
Yeah, so something like that. And I don't know if there's too many other examples of that. Unless, perhaps, I don't know, with the Nerevarine prophecy, you could go as a Nerevarine is technically like a mantling of Indoral Nerevar, Azura's champion, somewhat. Perhaps. That's how it works. It's not super clear, but
this was always how the Jyggalag podcast was going to go.
Yeah.
It was always going to get weird.
See, I get... It's interesting that some people put Jyggalag as their favorite, and I feel like this happens sometimes with Daedric princes when there's so little about them, you can put way more onto them, but then there's not a lot of actual... Like, to me at least...
At least the story of him becoming Sheogorath is definitely an interesting one.
yeah, it's interesting, but to me, that's what makes
That's what holds him
Sheogorath
together.
more interesting versus
Yeah,
Jyggalag.
of course.
Jyggallag's like a necessary component of him, but if you separated them, like right now, if you're like, I get to go to Jyggallag's realm and there's no Sheogorath real like necessary like involvement, and it's just like I'm here and it's all crystals and stuff. It's like, yeah, it'd be cool, but it's definitely not my top tier Daedric Prince or anything. Or he doesn't have a lot of personality, and I know that's his shtick. Is like I'm like this Prince of Order or so on, but
Yeah, like if you were the Prince of Boredom and that's your shtick,
then
that's still boring.
Yeah.
I know what you're saying.
It's a funny thing.
It is interesting. I like the whole idea of personal choice defying logical prediction, or at least that's why it said the Great Library was set aflame.
Well, this is why.
But then there's this weird like, I don't know if I'd call it a cope because it worked out to be the correct decision, but Sheogorath allowing Daius to live because of the knowledge he possessed is almost this strange. I don't know if you would call it a self-awareness, but. Honestly, it's probably just there so that Daius can exist and you can use his knowledge to save the day. But you'd think he would just destroy Daius as well.
Yeah. One thing, I guess, because it's going to come up a bit anyway, the whole like determinism sort of thing, and why in the Elder Scrolls I tend to not think that they are in the same way or at least thematically and so on, is that there's a massive emphasis on myth makes reality, and also when you look at Kim and the whole idea of achieving Kim, it is the denial of logic. You are making this like super truthful claim about yourself. Like, you're like, no, I exist. I just do. It's in the denial of logic and determinism that you achieve this great power.
I agree thematically. I kind of disagree just in the... You know what I think of determinism? I would just say that cause and effect led that person to be the kind of person who can deny reality.
But cause and effect becomes incredibly muddled when you're dealing with out of time places like Oblivion, stuff like that. Also, when you're dealing... If you add in basically any sort of spiritual element or sort of any everlasting component, it can affect things at different times. Or if you have any ability of your own myth making... that can outside, because something in your mind, like, oh, I make a myth, basically, and if that can actually manifest in reality.
Fine, but if we were talking about someone in our
That's
world,
different.
and they made but if they made a myth in their head, they made a story in their head, someone who believes in determinism could argue that that person made that story because of a bunch of cause and effect reasons and all these tiny micro influences throughout their entire life. You could say the same thing in the Elder Scrolls. The thing about determinism is that it's very hard to argue against it, but you can't... almost like a religion in a sense. Like, just because you can't prove it wrong doesn't mean it's right.
Yeah.
But it seems to be right from
maybe
a lot of different angles. So
yeah, but then again, it's also to be fair to a lot of people in ultimate determinism. It's almost impossible. Like you said, you need some ridiculous universal supercomputer to be able to understand all the causes and effects. But outside of that understanding, you are making an assumption that if there was a computer like that it would be able to, because there would be a logical consistency to everything.
Yeah.
So there is almost an element of belief in that, interestingly, because you have to go, I believe if there was a supercomputer or something, it would be able to.
Of course.
And if it could,
is why
then,
I said like a religion.
I think since we're dealing with this universe as opposed to our own, we kind of need to come in with the assumption that when you have this perfect stasis, this ineffable light, the introduction of chaos, the introduction of the void and limitation has to be one that is so impossible to define and cannot be determined whatsoever. That's its role in the creation of the universe, is that you cannot define it. Anything that spawns from that can never be predicted, even if you had a hyper future Elder Scrolls where you've got the supercomputers that can. It's purely the void. There's nothing to be rationalized.
I suppose something interesting is that a lot of Daedra, there are mortals who can, but let's just say the Daedric princes, they can foretell the future, or that there's this element of, I'm an omniscient being and I can see that this is going to happen, and it's actually true. And certain Daedric princes, such as Azura, and I mean, Vaemina claims to, but can send visions to, help a mortal, to know something will happen before it happens. Now, just like in real life, if we were to say determinism was the case in the Elder Scrolls, I suppose it can't be, because imagine you're reading a book of what's going to happen. The writing would have to be changing as you're reading it, because you have the ability to change it. And if you have the ability to change it, like you do in the Elder Scrolls, when a Daedric prince says, I can see this is going to happen, make sure it doesn't happen, and then you foil the plot, you've essentially defied...
Well, that's why...
a preset cause and
Well, that's
effect.
what the Moth Priests sort of kind of say about like the Elder Scrolls, is that these are the fabric of the universe, and they have all the prophecies of the whole Link Mundus and everything, but they're constantly shifting under their eyes. They'll change.
Then free will's confirmed in the Elder Scrolls.
I mean, thematically anyway, like the whole thematical principle of it is, like I said, it starts with Anu Padme. It's chaos versus order, free will versus determinism kind of thing. And the struggle between them, I think, is interesting. And, you can get really deep into it, but like, you have free will because you're the player character. Every other NPC is defined by code and stuff like that. But you have free will of your character. You can do things and so on. And, you can achieve Kim and use console commands, bro.
Whereas Darji has to go to his house and eat cheese at 12 p.m. He has to. Yeah. It is hard-coded into his simulation.
Yeah, but it does get interesting.
So, in a way, modders are kind of Padmeic in the sense that they break the code and allow new things to exist. But I guess in the sense they create new... determined things to put into the world, but we're constantly applying our free will to it. But I mean, to get us somewhat back on track, what is your take on like the Knights of Order? Because we really don't know much about them. the followers of Jyggalag.
My principle is that, well, they must have started as some... I just know that you know how you have certain characters throughout the course of the Shivering Isles DLC that join Jyggalag's side and they start wearing the armor and so on. I'm assuming that the Knights of Order are like the ultimate sort of like transformation along the lines. Like if you join Jyggalag, eventually you'll sort of become like them.
I always thought that the Knights of Order were kind of like Jyggalag's Daedra, and they're like stronger representations of him than the other enemy you encounter known as Priests of Order. And I may be wrong, but I believe that all references to people joining Jyggalag's side, like Sheogorath tells you, oh, it's disappointing, but, you know, some of the denizens of my realm join Jyggalag each Grey March. He specifically says a few times, I think, and become Priests of Order. You know the Priests of Order that look different? Yeah. And I believe one of the dukes of Mania or Dementia, the leaders... when they join Jyggalag's side and betray you, depending on which option you pick, they also take on like a Priest of Order-like entity. Yeah. I'm not sure if a mortal, if you can call someone who... are people born in Sheogorath's realm? Anyway, that's beside the point. Yeah, but people in Sheogorath's realm that he would refer to as kind of like mortals, just irregular folk. I'm not sure if they can become Knights of Order.
So if you want to have... Actually, here's an interesting thing. So there is that... We've used it before, but there's an interview from 2007 that they've got Kirk Coolman and Bruce Nesmith.
Which isn't canon necessarily.
Yeah, necessarily. But they're both people from Bethesda Softworks, and they're playing the role of like Haskell and Dias, right? And one of the questions is, so it says this: Dias, your master too has personal servants. Since the last Grey March, there have been reports of mighty hulking creatures known as the Knights of Order. Strangely, they seem to be nothing more than empty crystalline shells. Can these beings be considered Daedra as well, or are they entirely Jyggalag's creation, and thus outside the usual classification of Daedra? So Dias says this: the limited imaginations of Mundus's inhabitants are very amusing. There are many types of servants as stars in the sky. Daedra, as you call them, are but one of the more useful. The Knights of Order are yet another. My Lord Jyggalag is partial to their lack of creativity and independence. It's interesting. He in that Dias sort of says that they're not Daedra and they sort of exist.
He specifically references their lack of independence, which implies that they weren't Daedric. But yeah, it's hard to say because there's no explicit mention of their origins, whether they are... I mean, obviously they don't have Daedra hearts, they have Hearts of Order. And there are mentions of like, oh, they were once followers of Jyggalag, mortal followers who just saw his determinism so much that they were unable to maintain their free will. And there's nothing that actually says that in-game. But it does make sense as a kind of interesting Kim-like apotheosis. It's like it's the opposite to achieving Kim in the sense that you ascend beyond your mortality, become this kind of immortal creature in service to Jyggalag, but you do so without any of the I exist.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
It's kind of like Jyggalag's truth exists. Mm-hmm. Like the ultimate realization.
You've bonded with the source code, you know? You're like...
So what's the point of being anything other than this kind of nothingness crystal that just does its job and doesn't think for itself?
For sure. And I mean, just quickly, I'll just say even Dias kind of agrees with that. There's a quote from Dias where he says, the last remnant, individuality is an illusion. The details of my existence are no more important than the history of a stone. So it literally, like you were saying, like a crystal thing, like I am no more important than a stone, even though we know he is from our subjective view, but to him, you know, he's really sold on Jyggalag's truth.
That whole like back and forth between like Haskell and Dias, like I think that's also where you get the quote about like them not understanding like mortal conjecture on the Daedra and the doings of the Daedra different. But it's even this one, like where Haskell says, the elves, the most self-centered of the mortal races. It is inconceivable that anything could occur that has nothing to do with them at all. Do you really think that Oblivion exists solely as a shadow of Mundus? That everything that happens here is connected in some way with your pitifully limited world? I can tell you, speaking only for myself, of course, that sometimes entire minutes pass without me thinking of mortal affairs. But like, it is that sort of interesting idea that and remember to bring it back to basics, and this is like everything in the Elder Scrolls. It's all based on unreliable narrator and understanding and so on. But if you look at elven understanding of the mythos and everything, that's where you get the terms Aedra and Daedra, and that is from an elven dichotomy and their understanding of what those mean. So that's how it, like, you got to consider that there are things perhaps outside of that, and you know.
I suppose we should mention too that the reason Haskell had that response was because he was asked, pardon us for being so bold, but stories of the old mirror creation mythos say that the Lord Sheogorath was born when Lorkhan's divine spark was removed and the free Mundus, the mortal world, first came into existence. Might this relate to the curse that Jyggalag's jealous unbrothers placed on him? And Dias says, the Oldmer really think that. How amusing. And then Haskell goes on to go, the elves think everything revolves around them.
Yeah. Which is true, and I feel like it's interesting too, because I think the elven understanding of the world is actually quite limited in some ways, and I would have to go and comb through it again, but there's not a lot of mentions of a sort of cyclical kind of things. I feel like as they're like more Anuic, more order-like, they kind of see things a little A to B, like, oh, we fell from the god's grace, now we've come back down, and now we're where we are in time. But whereas if you look to like the Nords, or if you look to the Red Guards, they see things as this sort of cyclical kind of thing, and there's a little bit more focus on like myth and creation of stories. And you could even look at like, even the Bosmer are different. You know, they believe that they're literally like stories manifest almost, as sung by Ifri. And like, it's actually, I like to challenge the Ultima sort of understanding of things, because I think it comes from a very rigid point of view.
You can't really have the Ultima philosophy when you have Lorkhan creating this realm, because like Mundus is kind of contradictory in the sense that the Aedra keep limits on it, they keep it orderly, but all the inhabitants of Mundus are given the free will to break free from it. So it's kind of like, that's why you can have the Anuic and the Padamaic like fighting each other in the same place, because like the world is Anuic, but the people inhabiting it are inherently Padamaic, even if they happen to align with a more Altmeri worldview. Yeah, if that makes sense. Like, you have the ability to do something about it, which is why the Daedra so often get involved in order to kind of like will mortals or groups of mortals into kind of messing with this trap they're in.
But would you call it? But wouldn't Mundus, I guess, would you not call it Padamaic in conception, just because Lorkhan is like that kind of figure? And if you look at the emphasis of the everlasting versus limitation, because that's what like Mundus is. It's this limited cycle thing that Lorkhan tricked people into. And there's, mortality. They have limited power. It's no longer this sort of unlimited, ethereal power.
I agree with that, but at the same time, like, from the other perspective, when you have like people like Mankar Cameron saying that the Aedra usurped this realm from him, it's almost like this realm that's a limit. It's not everlasting. It's kind of like it's destroyed and comes back and whatnot. In having the Aedra kind of take control of this realm, it tries to become infinite almost. It's hard to say. That there's so much at play that it is hard to say. But I mean, from Jyggalag's perspective, I can kind of see why he doesn't like it, wouldn't like the mortal realm.
Yeah. It's interesting too, actually. Like, it obviously, like, hinging on the Mankar Cameron, what he says to be true. But like, that's also an interesting idea that there is this sort of Daedric sort of goal to actually make it everlasting or whatever. If you think about it, there's ideas about the cycles in general, like Kalpas or whatever, that this one is lengthened, and it's pretty, I would say, is pretty confirmed, considering the idea that Alduin came and was supposed to eat the world, but then he got sent forward in time, and he didn't complete, because he didn't complete his goal. He became a domineering dragon and all that kind of stuff, but sent forward in time. So you could argue that it has been lengthened already, like further than, I guess, than it would naturally end. So maybe perhaps, and if you look at Alduin as a sort of byproduct of what do you call it, of Akatosh, the big Akka soul, but also consider that actually there again, Mehrunes Dagon's whole goal in the Mythic Dawn uprising and stuff in the Oblivion Crisis was to tear down the world and bring it back to the Dawn. But then Akatosh, the time god, through Martin Septim, sort of, his avatar came out and stopped Mehrunes Dagon, which again lengthened to the cycle and let it going on. So maybe there's something there about the Aedra's need to create their own sort of everlasting or infinite.
What a mess.
Yeah.
I kind of just want to become a Knight of Order now. Just stop thinking about it and just turn to Crystal right now.
But
I mean, it could be worse. You could be one of the people that survive the Grey March and then end up having a huge, I guess, realization that's wrong, and then base your whole life around it. Like Surta. Is that how you pronounce it?
Surta.
In the Shivering Isles, when you need to remake the staff of Sheogorath and Dias is helping you, yeah, he sends you to get the Eye of Surta, which I think is how you would pronounce it, which is basically like this. She's a really old lady when you find her, but basically she somehow survived the Grey March, and she saw that Sheogorath wasn't there, like when Jyggalag came to attack, but she thought that Sheogorath had abandoned his realm.
Yeah.
Because she doesn't know the full truth that Jyggalag, that Sheogorath basically has to become Jyggalag. So then she lives with this group, the Apostles, and what she claims is the light is what she's all preaching about. But basically it's a cover-up for her own personal grudge against Sheogorath, who she thinks betrayed her. But regardless of her being wrong, you still need her eye, because it's this eye that's seen things that no other mortals have seen.
Yeah.
Which is pretty cool bit of lore.
Yeah. Interesting too, whatever connections and stuff I wonder that could be done later, but the relation between Jyggalag and what he wants in his like big realm of order, all that kind of stuff, and Sotha Sil and creating sort of this perfect clockwork world and so on. And it's interesting, there's this really cool concept art for Shivering Isles about the Knights of the Order. Yeah, I'll put it up on screen, but they're much more like gear oriented and sort of like all like clockworky looking, silvery kind of, almost look like really like robots and so on in terms of their face and stuff, and their the staffs are like all these like cool clockwork things. And it's like I really like the crystalline stuff too, so it's kind of like I like both, but I do really like this sort of clockwork design.
The concept art is always cooler. Speaking of clockwork stuff, there is a contraband item, Clockwork Jyggalag in the Elder Scrolls Online, which is a heretical effigy of the dethroned Daedric Prince of Order, which is said to seem uncomfortably at home in Sotha Sil's realm, which I find interesting. It's this little figurine on its knees with its hands clasped in front of it. I just like this idea of like Sotha Sil being so powerful and so like defiant, I guess, of the Daedra, that he has this little statue of Jyggalag on his knees.
Yeah. No, it's unfortunately there's not a heap more, I don't think, to say about him.
What about Jyggalag's sword, his artifact?
Oh yes. He has a sword and it's perfectly symmetrical. There you go. It's about it, honestly. It's there's not a lot, so
I can't even remember.
And it doesn't even really have much of a cool effect. I don't think it has any effect in the Shivering Isles. Call me crazy, but I have a feeling it's literally just does normal damage. It says it's capable of damaging creatures with a resistance to normal weapons, but it's basically an unenchanted claymore, which is,
very on brand, eh?
Nice. Yeah, I suppose it is, isn't it?
Yeah.
I suppose it is.
Yeah.
Some people theorize it has something to do with the staff of Sheogorath, but there's not a whole lot of evidence for that.
Yeah. It's a hell of a time, eh? Yeah. I think they could do something cool with Jyggalag and so on, the Daedric Prince, but to be honest, I wouldn't care if he got forgotten about, in the way that I'd rather Daedric attention be given to Daedric princes that have far more personality.
I do think he served his purpose in the Shivering Isles DLC. Like, his orderliness was important to contrast the Shivering Isles and Sheogorath for the service of that plot line. But having him just exist as his own entity now, there's not really anything juicy you can get from him short of him not being the way he is. we've kind of exhausted it. And as I'm sure we definitely know, and I'm sure a lot of people listening know, if you start getting into conversations about determinism, you just go around in circles until your mind turns to mush anyway. so like, he is a difficult one. But I think the most interesting thing about Jyggalag is the fact he was cursed to be Sheogorath, and their dynamic is what makes it interesting.
Well, now he's roaming the seas of oblivion, and who knows what he's up to. It's all a mystery. I personally would actually like to hear a bit of Jyggalag in the Elder Scrolls 6, whether it's just a little Jyggalag quest, like he has some secret shrine and you hear of his, I don't know, loftier goals or something like that. I definitely wouldn't want him to be like a main thing. Yeah. Like if that was the main story and Hammerfell's covered in crystalline structures, I'd be disappointed, as much as natural crystals in deserts can be really
maybe
cool.
Maybe even having a story,
probably wouldn't like
a story that revolves around, you could perhaps make it officially canon that Knights of Order were once mortal worshippers, and you've kind of got this person who's going through that process, and you can kind of help them along until they become this kind of mindless servant, or try and win them back. Or something
like I could even be going for, like, even if it was something like if you had Jyggalag sort of representation as part of a Sheogorath quest, and perhaps, like you're saying, like win them back or whatever, you could have some kind of character that, like Jyggalag and like Sheogorath are almost fighting over their worship, or like come to our side, and maybe you can help either.
It'd be hard to decide for them. You wouldn't really want to subject them to either of them. But there you go.
Yeah. But yeah, I think, have you guys, is that all to say on the Prince of Order?
Yep, I believe that's all there is to say. I'll end the video with a quote from the Elder Scrolls Blades server error loading screen, which says, "Mundus is not in order and Jyggalag needs time to restore it. Please visit the support site for more information and check out our social media links in the description below. There's a link to our Patreon as well as our merch if you want to help support the channel, and we all look forward to nerding out with you again very soon."